The Thaumaturge is a walk in the park, and the graveyard, and the suburbs, the pubs, the brothels, and salons in an early 1900s Warsaw that always gives you the uneasy feeling that something unfathomably evil is about to go down, until you realize that it's just a regular Tuesday in a world in which demons and dark magic are slightly more anecdotal than your average pub fight gone wrong. The Thaumaturge is an RPG-ish game in which you play as
Wiktor Szulski.
Wiktor Szulski, a man who's on a quest to find purpose, how very millennial of him, while he pulls the thread of his father's death in a city riddled with political unrest, intolerance to thaumaturgy, and forced cultural references that feel as though some European fund for culture called the developers after the game was done to complain that it didn't have enough culture. But Alex, you said RPG-ish game? What do you mean RPG-ish game? It's a bit difficult to explain, but you know the type: Dragon Age Origins, the Mass Effect saga, the Witcher saga, the Red Dead Redemption saga, those.
Oh, so RPGs for normies.
And the Thaumaturge is supposed to be one of those. But these other games I mentioned, they are quite the competition, wouldn't you say? So much so, in fact, that pretty decent games like Greedfall, which is very much in the same ballpark as those other titles, came out in the year 2019, and no one is talking about it anymore. Will that be the fate of the Thaumaturge? Well, let's find out, shall we? Welcome to You Old Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been plucking daisies about for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And as you also know, I review games using a system of categories that I feel are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. And today we have an RPG-ish game that takes place mostly in the Warsaw of the 1900s. A few years before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and it's a game that has its own brand of turn-based combat, and when it comes to those, character creation and character progression is up first. In this game you don't create a character, you play as Wiktor Szulski. And I'm going to tell you one thing, dear developers: if you are not going to let me create my own character, you better give me something like Geralt of Rivia, John Marston, or Harry Dubois to play as. So is Wiktor Szulski one of those? Well, no. But let's be realistic, Jax and Dalloy, for example, weren't either, and we still played those games all the way through to the end credits, didn't we? See, Geralt of Rivia was a bit of a lightning-in-a-bottle kind of fixed main character. By the time we met him in the video games, he had already been around for several books. He had friends, enemies, frenemies, bones to pick with some people, things he didn't like, and things he wanted to achieve in life. By the time we walked into the story to take the reins of his character, he had more history than your average high school textbook. In Disco Elysium, the player is put in the driver's seat of Harry Dubois, a man who doesn't know who he is or how or why he ended up in the floor of a hotel in a place that's not his hometown. And the player's job is to piece together the man's history, get him to come to terms with it, and seize the opportunity to take the memory wipe that resulted from a night of heavy partying as a clean slate and set him down a new path. Harry definitely existed before you, the player, walked into his life. And what a colorful life this man had before. But now it's up to you to decide the kind of man he's going to be. And I think this is how it should be with fixed characters in RPGs. One of my favorite passages in the Witcher series happens in The Witcher 2. If you go down the Yorveth path, you get to decide Prince Tennis's fate. And the two options that you are given are completely contradictory, to the point that one of them necessarily has to run contrary to who Geralt is, depending on the kind of Geralt that you have been playing. I was so curious about this particular decision that I decided to convince the mob to spare Stennis and let Accord decide his fate, because that's the kind of Geralt that I had been playing up until that point. A Witcher who had a strong sense of justice, but who still knew that it was not his place to judge and sentence others. But then I reloaded the game and took the decision to let the mob lynch Stennis. And I found it fascinating that Geralt made a very convincing case in both situations, and both arguments felt like they came from a person who had a strong sense of justice. Like Geralt of Rivia, Wiktor Szulski is a character with a past. He's had a complicated relationship with his father, he has a sister and a childhood friend with whom he shares a colorful past. But he's also found out that pride is his flaw. As a player, you cannot change any of these things, but you can decide how to deal with your past decisions. You can decide the kind of brother or friend that you want to be, and you are even given some input about how Viktor Szulski feels about many of these things. By the way, if the way I'm pronouncing Viktor Szulski is getting on your nerves, know that I do this for your own good, dear viewer. I'm only preparing you for what's to come if you decide to play this game, because the man sure likes to say his name and let every word linger every time he does.
Viktor Szulski
Is a thaumaturge, a being with a magical aptitude to deduct people's motivations, feelings, and thoughts by simply touching their earthly possessions. Thaumaturges can also use this information to tap into a person's psyche to manipulate them using said feelings, motivations, or fears. He inherited this aptitude from his father, Stanislav Szulski, an influential thaumaturge who worked towards the creation of a community of thaumaturges with a common agenda. Thaumaturgy is the core theme of the game in every respect. The reason why Viktor embarks upon the game's main quest has to do with thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy also greatly impacts Viktor's relationship with almost every character in the game, and in general, no one is indifferent to this magical aptitude. Some people are fascinated by it, but some people despise it. There is, for example, the Anti-Thaumaturge Society, who spreads fear and hatred against thaumaturgy and persecutes its practitioners, and it has no small amounts of adepts and supporters. Even the biggest political players have taken an interest in thaumaturgy. Some actively work against it, while some others seek to control it and use it to their own ends. Thaumaturgy is also at the very core of the game's character progression system. In the Thaumaturge, you have a skill tree with 4 different branches: heart, mind, deed, and word. And this is the only form of progression that you have, but I am very impressed with how relevant it is to everything there is to do in the game, which is namely combat and questing. In the Thaumaturge, you gain experience every time you advance a quest, and every time you beat a combat encounter. And this of course means that you level up in this game, and every time you do, you get a skill point that you can spend in any of these skills. These skills will determine the actions that you can execute during combat, as well as the enhancements that you can assign to each of them. This essentially means that you have an array of customizable spells. And while it is not super deep, you can come up with your own Fu Manchu tactics. Some dialogue options in many of the most crucial conversations of the game are locked behind a certain skill level. There are some quests that you can't even start if you don't have a good enough level of this or that skill. In this game you fight demons, or salutors as the game calls them, which we will be talking about later. What's interesting about these salutors is that beating them is relevant to Viktor's progression in more than one way. These entities work as thresholds for their corresponding skill. For example, you can't progress beyond the 4th skill level down the mind path until you find and defeat the salutor called Lelik. But in order to find Lelik, you need to start and fully commit to the quest that ends with his combat encounter. But some dialogue options, and therefore some major story branches, and therefore some major outcomes, require you to have a mind skill greater than 4. Which means that if you have not met and defeated Lelik and put a few more points into the mind skill, you will be locked out of major story branches that have mind skill checks. And I think this is fantastic. I was barely halfway through the game and I was already 100% determined to play it again, because your decisions are clearly tremendously impactful in this game, and the options available to you depend on the skills that you decide to cultivate. So, while this skill tree is the only form of progression that you have, it is actually quite remarkable how much of an impact it has over your gameplay experience. So, rating the game by the old premise that we have here on the channel, that a character progression system is only as good as the freedom it gives players to experience the game in their own terms, the Thaumaturge gets a pretty solid score. For a game in which you don't create your character, and in which your character isn't exactly a maelstrom of charisma and personality, but we'll talk about that later. Gameplay. The Thaumaturge's gameplay mix consists of questing, exploration, and combat, in that order of importance. Questing is actually very interesting in this game. It feels like an interactive TV show about a man gifted with magical powers who tries to get to the bottom of his father's demise and gets involved in much larger mysteries and political conspiracies as he digs deeper into his investigation. And it all happens in a city that has its own problems. Problems that find a way to trickle into Victor's life. None of the story missions are run-of-the-mill fetch quests or dumb MacGuffin chases. Well, aside from the main quest, which is to look for the Thaumaturge book that your father left for you. But hey, this is Future Sports Magazine and Back to the Future 2 kind of MacGuffin, which means it's the good type of MacGuffin chase. And everything you do in this game serves to advance the story, or to tell you more about the setting, or to tell you more about the characters. This game is heavy with idiosyncrasy, and quests serve not only to advance the story, but for you to get thoroughly immersed into the Warsaw of the early 1900s, its peoples, and its mindset. The Thaumaturge is not precisely an action-packed title, but there is gripping tension in many of its passages. You can feel the pressure mount in many of the game's main and secondary storylines, and the few action bits that you do get in this game have greater impact because they are usually at the climax of conflicts that escalated to a point in which violent confrontation was inevitable. The best thing, though, is that it is not an on-rails experience. You truly have a great deal of agency over what happens and how it happens. There are 3 different endings that require you to follow very different paths for the final stretch of the game. Paths that involve different locations, characters, and outcomes. And over the course of the game, you take different decisions that result in significantly different outcomes, and many of them get acknowledged in the final recollection of events that you get right before the credits roll. Sometimes, though, you have no choice but to put someone in their place. And sometimes you do have other options, but you just want to put people in their place. And that's where combat comes in. Combat is turn-based, and I totally applaud that they went for their own system. You have an initiative system, and both friendly and hostile actions take some time to execute. Quicker actions will usually trigger before your enemies get the chance to do their thing, while longer actions may have a more powerful effect, but will also let your enemies take their action before you do your thing. And that can potentially disrupt what you were going to do to them. Your skills can be upgraded with modifiers that you learn as you progress further into your skill tree, and these modifiers are very tactical. For example, you can add a modifier that has 50% chance of interrupting enemy actions to your quickest attack, which does shit damage, but is faster than anything your enemy can do. Salutors are demonic entities that feed on people's flaws. As a Thaumaturge, you can detect these flaws in people's characters and then pull the thread to discover the demon that's taken control over them. Salutor fights are the standout combat encounters in this game, and some of these creatures rank pretty freaking high in the creep factor. Whenever you defeat a Salutor, you can tame it and add it to your little demonic army, and from then on out, you are able to use his abilities during regular combat encounters and for some non-combat situations. The most fun part about the combat in this game is that you can work out interesting synergies between your skills and those of your Salutors, though I wish there had been more cross-Salutor synergies. I think it's a crime that you cannot combine your Salutor's talents in any significant way. But because this game is an interactive historical novel of sorts, you only ever get to fight against human enemies who are armed with pretty conventional weaponry, which is what you would expect people to have around that time. Pistols, carbines, knives, clubs, etc. The only exception to this are the Salutor fights, which you could say are like boss fights. Sometimes regular humans have strange powers that they absolutely shouldn't have though, but I guess the game needed to make encounters more challenging as you became more powerful. Locations in the Thaumaturge are pretty big, and they also feel like proper city spaces, intricate in their design, busy, and lived in. I've never been to Warsaw or Prague. Well, I've been to Prague, but not 1900s Prague. But telling by the footage that we have access to today of what these cities used to look like, I would say the game's locations look pretty accurate. Walking about in these cities is a bit of a mixed experience though. These places are cool to look at, and every once in a while you run into an actual non-mandatory quest or cutscene, which is pretty cool. But if you run around the game's various locations using your Thaumaturge AoE quest revealing powers,
AKA snapping your fingers like some gay lunatic,
you'll uncover some of these clickable points of interest, which trigger secondary quests. But to me, these secondary quests are more like second-rate quests, and they really dampen the fun for me. These secondary quests are supposed to be side mysteries that you can solve, but there is nothing to solve, because unlike the actual quests in the game, in which you have to interact with characters, go to locations, and take decisions that have an impact on the story, or on the NPC's opinions of Viktor Shulsky, the quests that begin with these points of interest are nothing but long successions of quest markers that you have to mindlessly chase and click on to see some boring, useless text snippet until you click on the final ones that get you that one last boring, useless text snippet and a hand-drawn sketch that marks the end of the quest. And the worst thing about these quests is that some of them can only be done at a certain time of day, which means that you'll have to look for a public bench to sit on and go through this pointless little cutscene to fast forward to the right time of the day for the quest. And sometimes this happens while it's raining, and sometimes it's a quest that you can only do in the morning, and that means that Viktor Shulsky, a member of a wealthy Warsaw family who owns a huge house just a few blocks away, has to spend the night sitting on a public bench just to get the quest done. Goodbye, immersion. See you around. The problem with these points of interest is that they give you experience points, so if you want Viktor Shulsky to have the maximum possible level, you have to engage in this mindless, pointless quest marker persecution. Why are these secondary quests even in the game? In truth, these mysteries are poorly disguised culture snippets that are shoved down your throat in the clumsiest possible way. At some point I even asked myself, man, what's the point of all of this? Did these people get a grant from some public European fund to promote culture or something? Oh, right. It feels as though the developers already had a solid game with very good quests which were already embedded in culture and history, and they presented it for validation to some dumbass brain-dead officer in charge of promoting culture and giving grants for some dumbass institution, and he or she said, "It doesn't have enough culture, we need more." So they went ahead and dumped a fuck ton of these dumbass text snippet chasing quests on the game to add some culture. And it made the game feel like a fine Edradur whiskey that had been watered down to the point of blandness. In my very personal opinion, don't get your panties in a bunch, that's what happens when you take money from large evil corporations or public institutions alike. They tend to demand shit that does not always work in the game's benefit. And don't get me wrong, I'm not at all against these cultural references, but there are ways to weave them into the narrative to make them seamless. In fact, this game does a pretty fantastic job with that. With the bits of lore that you can find here and there and with its regular quests. But these quest for the next text snippet bullshit was not good. I mean, if you wanted to tell me about the balalaika, you could have had a musician NPC tormented by a salutor of nostalgia or something. I'm thinking he could have been called something like Alexander. Yeah, something like that. And maybe you could have had Viktor find out more about the shit that torments him by holding the balalaika and maybe strumming it for a bit. Without this secondary quest BS, the gameplay aspect of this title could have been a solid 8.5 out of 10. It's also missing a few extra things that some other games in the ballpark have, but we're going to be talking about those later. As it is, it's not terrible, but it's also not great. Story and lore. So before you even start to play the game, you get this disclaimer. Fooled Theory is a team of people with diverse beliefs, religions, sexual orientations, and gender identities. Our goal is to tell mature stories that are meant to be a source of reflection for players. We would like to point out that in creating a game that draws so much inspiration from the past, we could not leave out the portrayal of certain attitudes and views that are rightly considered unacceptable today. Well, no shit, Batman. Dear 11-Bit Studios, did any of these institutions ask you to include this disclaimer, or did you decide to include it out of your own initiative? Because let me tell you something, it is not needed. If there's anyone who could potentially be offended by any character or situation depicted in your game, or think that you endorse certain behaviors or mindsets because you include in your game characters who have them, first, it's people who are not worth convincing that the mindsets portrayed don't reflect your own, because they're just too dumb or fanatical to understand this. Second, what are they going to do if they get offended? Raise a ruckus over on Twitter? Boycott your game? No, because third, people who could potentially be offended by the content of your game aren't even going to buy your game to begin with. All this disclaimer did was give me the impression that I was about to play a soy-drenched game that was going to dance around potentially offensive themes and take extra care not to offend modern-day sensitivities. But then I started playing the game, and I got immersed into the whole deal almost immediately. And that's because the writers did exactly what they had to do. They provided some breadcrumbs for me to piece together what was going on, where, and why. They refrained from showering me with information dumps, and they relayed all the necessary information by showing us much and telling us little as they could. Good stuff, I thought, during those first passages. But I was still a bit cautious and uncomfortable because of that initial disclaimer. But my fears slowly started to dissipate as Victor progressed further into his adventure. And what an adventure it was, guys. The story in this game is actually pretty fucking awesome. This chapter in Viktor Shulski's adult life starts with a journey to the remote confines of Georgia. Victor's health is rapidly waning and his issues are related to thaumaturgy, and that's why he needs a special treatment from a very special kind of healer. And this healer is none other than Gregory Rasputin himself. And what a character this man is, guys. I'm no expert on Rasputin, and what I know about the man is limited to what I have read in history books and to that film featuring Alan Rickman from the mid-90s, which I thought was pretty badass at the time. But this character 100% nailed the idea that I had of Rasputin, and it has quickly become a strong contender for best NPC ever in the history of RPGs, along with Sigismund Dijkstra from The Witcher and Deonara from Planescape Torment. Rasputin initially comes off as a compassionate man, truly worried about the well-being of the people in his care, Viktor Shulski included. But over the course of the game, he slowly but steadily starts to become shadier and more contentious until it reaches a point in which you can almost cut the tension with a knife in every conversation that you have with him. By the end of the game, his very presence is enough to give you the creeps, and there are moments in which you can even shit yourself if you're not careful. And the writers and developers worked jointly to play every trick in the book to emphasize his character arc. At the beginning of the game, you meet him in bright and sunny locations, and the tone of his voice is gentle and kind. But as he becomes more and more manipulative and less tolerant about you not playing along with his schemes, his tone and expression stiffen and your meetings start to take place in locations that are either creepier or darker or both. And what makes him extraordinarily creepy and menacing is that this game respects you as a player and lets you pick up the subtleties rather than smack you on the face with explanations. See, the game starts with your trip to Georgia, and it's mostly a silent trip on a train. You look pale and sweaty, so it's obvious that there's something wrong with you. There's a frightening-looking spectral entity accompanying you, and it's obvious that you're not disturbed by its presence in the slightest. You're reading a letter from someone, and you can easily gather that it's from your sister. You can also tell that she cares about your well-being, that she's not crazy about the fact that you went looking for some fabled mystical healer to help you with your troubles, but that she has come to terms with it, and that you didn't want your father to know where you were going or why. But you're not told these things, because you can easily piece them together from the context. What I mean is that this information is conveyed in a way that is lean, organic, and it doesn't underestimate the audience. If this had been an Owlcat game, you probably would have had a narrator saying something like, "You travel with Upir, a salutor, who has been with you since you were a child." And you would have surely gotten the text version of the narration as well, and the word salutor would have been surely highlighted for you to hover over and get a tooltip with a lengthy definition about what a salutor is. Also, as soon as you arrive to the train station, you send a message to your sister to tell her about your current situation, and the postmaster, who's wearing a uniform with a Romanov coat of arms in the back, very clever shot by the way, asks where you want to send it, and then this conversation follows.
Warsaw. Russia.
And this is supposedly Georgia. Russia here and Russia there. Russia everywhere, on every map.
And I think this conversation, as inconsequential as it might seem, is brilliant because first, you can tell that the game takes place during a time in which Poland was under Russian occupation. Second, at first, you don't rightly know how much Victor cares about the political situation. He's obviously Polish.
Victor with a W, not a V.
So you would assume that he does care quite a bit. What you can tell for sure is that he doesn't want to risk it. He's probably a practical man, so because his reasons to be there have nothing to do with politics, he avoids potential arguments and maybe even danger, and just says what he needs to say to get the letter sent to Warsaw. Third, once the postman, who's obviously less smart than Victor, makes full disclosure of the fact that he's also not crazy about the Russian occupation, Victor then goes on to say that maps change. So if you had any doubts about where he stood, they were surely dissipated with his answer. And this is pretty much how the game handles its narrative all the way through. It's immersive and lean, gripping when it has to, mysterious when it needs to, and always entertaining.
Minus spoilers coming your way.
After Rasputin helps you with your condition and after you collect your first and most badass salutor, the Bukovac, you learn that your father died and you have to go back to Warsaw to take care of things. And once you're back in Warsaw, you learn that your father died under strange circumstances. And that's when you start pulling the thread of the mystery behind your father's death. And it's quite impressive how one lead takes you to another, and in the process, you become entangled in stuff that goes from otherworldly sinister machinations to political intrigue that goes as far up as the Tsar's regime itself. And all throughout the adventure, you'll be forced to deal with some serious moral dilemmas that often involve deciding between a reproachable path that is easier to follow and one that's probably costlier, but it's also one that'll probably let you sleep better at night. Most characters in the Thaumaturge are morally grey, but they all feel realistic and like a product of their time. It's still nice that you have characters who are straight shooters through and through that you can always count on, and it warms the heart that most of them are family. Speaking of family, the thing that stands out the most to me in this game, by far, it's your relationship with your childhood friend Bioware. This guy is like a brother to Viktor Szulski, and your relationship with the dude is as real as shit can get. The man has not completely forgiven you for something very serious that happened when you were teenagers that, long story short, translated into his father clutching the short straw instead of you. So he harbors resentment towards you for that, but he also loves you every bit as much, because his sense of kinship is as strong as they come, and you truly are like family to him. The man puts you through some serious tests, as men usually do, for you to prove that you're willing to do shit that you don't like to make up for that very bad thing that you did when you were children. And because you're supposed to be his friend, and friends do shit for friends, even if they don't totally agree. Especially if they owe you big time. Or at least that's how Bioware understands friendship. But it works both ways, and when the 20-gallon bag of shit hits the fan, he's there for you, and he doesn't even hesitate to do stuff that would get him into serious trouble, and he doesn't ask anything in return, for no other reason than the fact that you are his friend. But the best thing about this is that all of this only happens if you've been watering the right plant. Because see, over the course of the game, you can either avoid Bioware, or straight out refuse to help him with all the shit he needs to do. Either because you fear that it might get you in trouble, or simply because you wouldn't agree to do these things if you were in Victor's shoes. But if you do avoid him, or if you refuse to help him, you'd be feeding his resentment towards you even further instead. Bioware hates your father more than you do. The man's name was Stanislav, and Bioware calls him Satanislav. That should tell you all you need to know. And he has a very good reason not to like him. But when you have a heart-to-heart conversation with Bioware after one of the more complicated and tense passages of the game, if you say that you resent your father for sending you away, despite the fact that that was kind of the thing he resents you for, Bioware says that your father did what he had to do to protect you, more or less implying that he would have done the same thing in his place, which speaks volumes of the man's sense of kinship. The game also calls those personality traits that can be exploited by salutors flaws. And it's interesting because at some point you are given the chance to remove a flaw from someone you care about, and later on in the game this person becomes almost unrecognizable, and as little as you have been in Victor's shoes, you feel like you stole something from that person, and you feel bad about it. And I think this is a poignant way to say that humans are collections of flaws and virtues. They are a take it or leave it package. And if you had the power to exercise that one thing that you don't like about a person to turn him or her into your ideal version of them, you'd see the minute you exercised this power that that person would cease to become who he or she was altogether. So the story in the Thaumaturge can be very thought-provoking and deep. My only real gripe with it is that, if you think of it, Victor is a grown-ass man in the early 1900s who has daddy issues that feel like shit she should have come to terms with long ago. But oh well, it's not too annoying or disruptive. The game has 3 different big endings that branch out into several more depending on the decisions you made over the course of the game. But one of these endings is so motherfucking epic that it rivals some of the best endings that there've ever been. Which makes me wonder why this game flew under so many people's radars. It's epic, however, in its own way. Don't expect dramatic, over-the-top action a la Suicide Mission in Mass Effect 2, or the vampire invasion that takes place in Beauclair at the end of The Witcher Blood and Wine. The game is always sober and grounded in verisimilitude, and it sticks to that like glue, which I can very much appreciate. One of you over on Discord said that if these institutions were involved in the funding of the game, chances are it needs this type of disclaimer. And I don't know if I would go that far, but you do get the term bigot thrown around rather frequently, and I highly doubt that Polish people around the early 1900s would use that term to refer to people like Stanislav, who in truth doesn't seem like a bigot to me. And I have early to mid 2010 standards for these things. Also, I find it a little hard to believe that this person would be the leader of the hardened, tough-ass socialists who seek to oust the Russian occupation. Okay, whatever. But truth is, she isn't even a bad character. In fact, I think none of them are. Quite the contrary. Svetlana, Ariel Rofe, Madame Samida, Konechkin, and your sister Ligia, to mention a few, are solid characters with distinct personalities, all of whom talk and behave like a product of their background and times. The people possessed by the salutors show pathologies that are 100% consistent with their flaws, and characters like your friend Abauditse, and especially Rasputin, stand head and shoulders not only above everyone else in this game. I would say they even rub shoulders with some of the best NPCs in the history of gaming. The plot itself is a collage of short stories. Some of them are self-contained, some of them are chapters in the main quest, but they all work like building blocks to something greater. The pace, if you take away the idiotic quest marker chasing side quests, is pretty solid. And overall, I would say this game pretty much beat the crap out of my expectations story-wise, because none of the reviews I watched seemed to give enough credit to the game in this department. So I'm going to come out and say it. This is one of the best stories told in a video game in recent memory. Probably the best since Disco Elysium. This aspect of the game alone is absolutely worth the price of the admission if you ask me. Companions lore-wise. There aren't any! Or are there? You don't really have companions in the traditional sense. When you defeat and tame a salutor, they immediately become part of your little demonic army. And these creepy bastards do more than just fight at your side. They have skills that help you overcome some story moments, and it's pretty fucking creepy when you use them to such ends. They have no dialogue lines and no personalities to speak of, but their aspects are pretty telling of the type of demonic influence that they have over their victims. They come off as the most corrupt depiction of the flaw they seek to exploit, but I'm still not sure they count as companions for lore purposes. Companions gameplay-wise. These salutors are playable characters. You can choose which of them you want to use during combat, which means you can choose which of their skills to use on your enemies. You can also change salutors during a fight, and you can combine your own skills with that of your salutors to come up with your own little tactics. For example, I always used the skill called Old Wound in combination with the Bukavak's Howl skill, to curse as many enemies as possible, and then on the next round, I used the demon's bloody wedding skill that causes 8 damage per cursed enemy on the target. I would also often change to my trusty old Upir to use his life-stealing skill to keep my health up. This is a pretty decent tactic for situations in which you are vastly outnumbered. But other salutors have their own situational advantages as well. Morana, for example, can be pretty freaking overpowered against enemies with high focus, and the Veles can one-shot some of the peskier ones if luck is on his side. Like I said, I wish demons had more solid cross-salutor skills. I find it a bit frustrating that they don't. But while it is pretty good, combat isn't really the focus of this game, so these demonic companions are good enough as they are, I think. I like that you can also use them for many non-combat situations, and their talents can open up entire story branches, so that makes them pretty solid companions in the gameplay department in my book. Secondary mechanics and user experience. This is a game with very few secondary mechanics. You don't have an inventory, there isn't any trading, and the only thing you do outside of combat, dialogue, and snapping your fingers like a fabulous lunatic to activate your quest marking magics is skill management and going over journal entries. And I think these RPG-ish games need a few more mechanics to make you feel like you are a part of the world. The Witcher series had boxing, arm wrestling, horse races, Gwent, sleeping with hookers. Mass Effect had arcades, and Red Dead Redemption had all sorts of secondary activities. And I think this game needed a little bit of that. The lack of these things makes the Thaumaturge feel a little bit more like a point-and-click adventure game with a few RPG mechanics. And listen, adding secondary mechanics to make you feel more like a part of the world would have been the perfect excuse to inject a little bit of culture into your game in a way that's more fun and less intrusive than those dumb quest marker chasing culture-y secondary quests. I think Black Book, for example, did it very well by introducing you to the traditional Russian card game Durak, which you can play with many of the NPCs in the game. As far as user experience goes, like we said, the Thaumaturge plays almost like a point-and-click adventure game from the mid-90s with some combat, and from a user experience perspective, it's all it needs to be. I find it quite remarkable that combat is completely different from anything you've seen before, and yet, it has almost zero learning curve. If you are someone who's played games with turn-based combat before, you are probably going to have questions like, how do I know the order in which enemies and allies are going to act? Or, actions are described as quick and slow, but how long exactly do they take? And what do each of these immunities mean, and how do I undo them? And the answers to these questions are exactly what you expect, and you find them exactly where you expect to. And this is quite impressive for a system that we've never seen before. And I'm very pleased with the UX in combat encounters. I'm the kind of guy who doesn't like to learn new ways of doing old things. If something works, why change it? But if things can be more efficient, and this efficiency does not come at the cost of having to learn new, more complicated things, then shut up and take my money. And the Thaumaturge is a very good example of this. Sound effects and mix. Sound effects are what they need to be for the most part. The Thaumaturge features immersive city spaces, and the sound plays its part competently. Though after running around in a city as busy as Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 3, every isometric city space in every game is going to have a hard time living up to that standard. We've said that combat is grounded in verisimilitude like most other things in the game, but I still think the sounds lack gravitas and oomph, especially when salutors are involved. The sound mix is also going to be inevitably compared to modern isometric games like Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous or Baldur's Gate 3. There are various classical pieces that you can hear in some phonographs that you can find around the city, and when you start playing them, they go from sounding like they are really coming out of an early 1900s phonograph to an actual modern day recording. But this is not something new. The Saboteur already did this in the year 2009, and better. So, sorry guys, but this is the year 2024, not the early 2000s, and this sound mix, while not terrible, is not really up to par with modern day standards in the sound department. Music. The music in this title is pretty good. It ticks all the boxes that you expect. It's lore consistent, the various soundtrack pieces are in tune with the dramatic intention of the passage in which they are featured, and overall, the soundtrack reflects the taciturn demeanor of the game. You also have several classical pieces that go from Mussorgsky's Tuileries to Claude Debussy's Arabesque to Chopin's, or should I say Chopin's Nocturne, etc. Very culture-y all. All in all, it's very consistent with the game's overall artistic vision, the time period, and the theme. Good stuff. Voice acting.
A bouquet of sweat, shit, and puke. And piss, thanks.
But it's Warsaw's piss and puke, interwoven with the aroma of steadfastness and heroism.
I strongly believe that a person is innocent until proven guilty.
Of course. So, we're at an impasse. What do you propose?
I came to pick you up. You'll be safe with my associate.
What associate? Where?
In Pavansky. The neighborhood, not the cemetery.
Wasn't making your own dream come true enough for you, Kane? You had to ruin mine. How treacherous of you. How petty-minded.
Do you want to know what enticed me to do that?
If you're kind enough.
It's a mixed bag really, because Ariel Rofe, Carnage King, and Svetlana sound pretty convincing, but Victor himself and About Itzy many times sound like they are reading their lines for the first time. It's not terrible, and I'm definitely thankful that they didn't go the other way by overdoing it, but I think this game could have used a little bit more voice directing. Graphics. This one is a little bit hard to appraise. I don't know where you stand with graphics, guys. If you're the kind of guy who cares about how the game performs and looks with X resolution and X FPS and anti-aliasing and blah 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 blah, then you're probably going to say that it doesn't look good. I tried to review this aspect of a game taking into account both technical and artistic merit for the time in which the game was made. But I admit I'm not exactly the best person to evaluate the technical aspect. I do believe, however, this game nails the artistic aspect of the visuals. Character models are unique and they are detailed enough, though there is a huge difference between the good ones and the not so good ones. Garments and accessories are elaborate and consistent with the times depicted, and I think they did an exceptional job with the locations. City spaces in particular are busy and alive, and they feel lived in. Just walking about in the cities of Warsaw, Prague, and these other places that I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce, it's a joy all by itself. Even when you're snapping your fingers fabulously trying to find a new point of interest to get the sweet XP. This is what you get, mates. This is what a salutor fight looks like. This is what a conversation with an NPC looks like.
I'm happy for you, but do restrain your joy. We're in the cemetery.
And this is what walking around city spaces looks like. Now you decide whether you think it's good or not. Also, every time you start to play the game again, you get an animated loop of Victor standing next to the latest salutor that he has brought into his little demonic army, and I think this is a nice detail. I guess the only real gripe that I have with the graphics is the way about it looks. This man is supposed to be an aggressive, quick-tempered, violent man, hardened by the tribulations of the street. I mean, he didn't have to look like Andres Galota, but the very notion that this feeble sack of bones who looks like an early 1900s version of your average K-pop star is a man who's not to be trifled with is just straight out laughable. And I don't think this is a minor nitpick because this is a very important character and he just doesn't look the part. Not in the slightest. But that aside, I think graphics in this title are excellent. Performance and stability. Apparently the Thaumaturge had all sorts of issues when it first came out and people were complaining left and right about the game shutting down during cinematics and graphics going glitchy when things got busy. And yes, sometimes hares act like they have a life of their own, and sometimes when I started the game, the opening loop looked like Viktor Shulsky actually had been possessed by a salutor. But the game never crashed and it only froze momentarily once. I also didn't experience any bugs, and loading times were pretty acceptable, but do check your system specs and the forums before you buy, because I had absolutely no problems, but I know some people did. But I have to call things as I see them, and in my experience, for an indie game that has so many branching paths, that is as ambitious as this one, this game performs pretty smoothly. Other considerations and final thoughts. You know that feeling that you get when you see the credits roll and think, man, this was good. I'm going to remember this for years to come, and you want to play it again immediately? That feeling is reserved for very few titles. Premium RPGs, if you will. Well, that's the feeling that I got by the end of the Thaumaturge, even though it isn't a premium RPG. It's a game of highlights though, and it would have been a lot tighter if they hadn't injected these culture snippets as second-rate quest marker chases. If you are looking for a game that focuses on combat, the Thaumaturge isn't it. If you are looking for intense, over-the-top action with witty one-liners, the Thaumaturge isn't it. But if you are starved for mature stories, play your agency, and if you want your decisions to matter in a story that is actually good and takes place in a time and place that is rarely explored in the realm of video games, well, I can't think of too many games that'll do it for you more than the Thaumaturge. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.